Welcome to Trending in Education, the new college president edition of Trending in Ed. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Eileen Wilson-Oyelaran, who is the president emerita of Kalamazoo College and a senior consultant at the Association of Governing Boards, and Terrence J. MacTaggart, who served as the chancellor of University of Wisconsin Superior, the University of Maine system, many other roles similar in the higher ed universe. And he's also a senior fellow with the Association of Governing Boards. They are the co-authors of this book, The New College President: How a Generation of Diverse Leaders is Changing Higher Education. Eileen and Terry, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, good to see you, Mike.
Great to have both of you on. We always begin with origin stories, getting a sense of who people are and their backgrounds. I know that'll be relevant to this conversation about how it's difficult to be a university president in this day and age. And there's a lot of stories and case studies we'll get into in a bit. But before we do that, maybe we'll start with you, Eileen, and then we'll pick up with you, Terry. Can you share with us a little bit who you are and how you got to this point in your career?
Well, thanks, Mike. I grew up in Southern California, South Central Los Angeles, went to Pomona College, where I would confess that I was a very active student activist, but also fell in love with higher education as the place where I thought real social change could take place. Had a study abroad experience after graduation that took me to West and East Africa, came back, finished my doctorate, and spent the first 14 years of my academic career teaching and doing research in Nigeria. I returned in the late 80s and had an opportunity to be a department chair and eventually a dean and eventually a college president, all at small institutions. I was at Winston-Salem State, a historically Black institution, Salem College, a college for women, and then finally Kalamazoo College in Michigan, where I served as president. And then working with boards and presidents, trying to continue to serve higher ed.
Amazing stuff. And that'll be a background that'll overlap in interesting ways with the book. We'll get more into that in a bit. Terry, can you give us a similar snapshot?
My career is not as illustrious as Eileen's, but my doctorate is in 18th century British literature. At one time, I knew more about Gulliver's travels than anybody else on the face of the earth. But in the interest of success, I also got an MBA and was fortunate enough to be elected to Phi Beta Kappa and some other things like that. But my origin story, and I'll take you very seriously on that, was my dad had a sixth grade education. He was a master sergeant and a life server in the U.S. Army, a World War II vet. My mother had to quit school in order to raise money for her family during the Depression. And a lot of my motivation and my interest in sort of, if I can say, outsiders who should move to the top of the line in higher ed comes from that origin before I became an academic.
Yeah. And maybe sticking with you there, Terry, what's the problem space that we're talking about? What's the book about?
Well, the book is about the challenges that face presidents these days. You know, we're in a kind of hinge moment, as it's been described. The historic view of a president was typically a white male, kind of maybe a little above 6 feet, and kind of avuncular, wise, and then presided over the university. That just doesn't cut it anymore. The contemporary president needs to be a fighter, needs to be someone who's not going to quit under any conditions because the challenges have gone way up. And as we discovered in the book, and we had an insight, but then we researched it thoroughly to see if our insight was accurate, was the people that had challenging upbringings tended to make better presidents than those who were raised on easy street. And that's kind of the core of the book. Today's president, they need to be smart, they need to be politically savvy, but they also need to have grit, resilience, persistence, character virtues, if you will, to make it in the current, as you know well, contested environment.
Yeah. And Eileen, can you flesh out a little bit some of the challenges that a university president, a university leader is facing nowadays?
Yeah, I can. But the other thing I think I want to add is that the people who would normally take these jobs, the provosts, the deans in larger institutions, have come close up and they don't want to do it anymore.
Mm,
because they have seen, particularly if they've worked in effective senior leadership teams, they've seen how difficult it is. And
yeah.
so finding people with the courage, the commitment, the job is almost indefinable at this point. You are a political animal, you are an academic leader, you are a change agent, and at the same time, you're grappling with social media, with the intrusion of political considerations where they're not necessarily helpful for the running of an institution. You've got an enrollment cliff. So
Hmm.
everyone is concerned about the census of the student body, and you've begun to get
Yep.
some distrust of higher education. So you put all of those together in a rapidly changing technological environment. I mean, we still don't know what AI means for higher
Right.
ed. And when we get a handle on something, it's going to change by tomorrow.
Yeah, and then the reality is that the president is frequently a lightning rod or a scapegoat where even if you're new to the job, all those problems are immediately on your lap and folks are immediately expecting you to say all the right things and do all the right things. And I'm a bit of a Star Trek fan. It's a bit of a Kobayashi Maru test where frequently there's no easy way out. There's not a real winnable scenario, and you kind of want the makeup to be able to handle those really hard challenges.
And there's no grace. And so
Mhm,
you really have to be able to separate yourself from
mm.
the work and your own personal response to what's happening to you, to the mission of the institution and why you're doing what you're doing and how you want to move the institution forward. And I actually think we see that in all of the presidents whose profiles are included there in some way.
Yeah, and I wanna get into that next because you do outline 7 university presidents, 7 examples, case studies of folks who have really thrived in these disruptive, challenging times. I listened to your interview on NPR, Terry, and you were also mentioning how it's perhaps less rewarding to be a university president. It's almost like you need to find your rewards in different places. Before we get into the case studies and the methodology, I thought that was an interesting point, and I'd like to hear a little bit of your perspective on that.
Thank you, Mike. It's one of the things we discovered along the way that if you say to yourself as a president, "Oh, I finally made it. I must be okay. They made me a president." Well, think again. You're always, as Eileen suggested, you have to be a target for one interest group or another, or you mentioned polarization, which is certainly the reality, not just in the public institution where you kind of expect it, but in the independents as well, because of the
Yeah.
makeup of different board members. So one thing we discovered in researching each of the 7 and then confirmed it was they all had a sense of mission. Sometimes it was connected to their religious upbringing. One of them, Jeff Bullock, who we might talk about later, is an ordained minister in addition to having a PhD from the University of Washington. But for others, it was kind of a secular mission. But they had a fire burning inside of them that they were going to prevail and persist to get this good work done and not
Mm.
let a problem that might daunt somebody else or somebody who was a careerist, and thought this is a nice tour of duty and I get a car. And we're saying if you don't have that flame, that sense of mission, wherever it comes from, think twice about whether you ought to be a president or not.
Yeah, and to that end, it seems like a combination of that mission, fire in the belly, but then also some resilience, some ability to withstand adversity and grit.
Exactly. We
That
encourage boards that are looking for new presidents or even ready to promote somebody from within. Okay, you look at the academic pedigree. Do they know the business? Do they understand the importance of shared governance and academic freedom? But do they also have the courage, the guts, the grit, the resilience to take criticism and move ahead? And frankly, the kind of emotional, social intelligence to work with a broad range of people, many of whom will not be fans of theirs.
right. And then Eileen, I know the methodology, you landed on these 7 case studies, but there was a lot of work that kind of went into the research, hundreds of interviews and a forensic approach where, really the output is a set of tools, a set of guidelines and examples of how boards of trustees and other folks who are thinking about leadership for their universities, also university higher ed leaders who are looking to really take on that mantle of leadership. There are certain profiles, certain characteristics that you uncovered.
Well, I think what we did was we have had between Terry and myself a lot of opportunity to work with boards, to work on presidential assessments. So we had, with our various experiences, a good sense of what enabled institutions to move forward, what effective leadership looked like, what were some of the most important accomplishments that were necessary to keep moving institutions forward in terms of their fiscal viability as well as their coherence and achievement of mission. And so we identified presidents largely based on that in conversation with colleagues, also their kind of national profiles in some cases and reputation, but a pretty intimate knowledge of the individuals that we had an opportunity to interview. And
Yeah.
then we did a series of interviews with them. We talked to many members of their executive teams. We talked to board members. We talked to students in many cases at the institutions, are now alumni, but who had been students during the presidency, to get a broad profile of strengths and challenges and issues overcome. And I
Hmm.
think it gave us a very broad understanding of each of the individuals that we profiled. Each was very
Hmm.
unique. Their institutions were unique, the presenting challenges, but in many ways required similar skills, empathy in many cases, the capacity to hear multiple points of view, courage, the ability to communicate effectively. And as Terry has indicated, an underlying commitment to mission and mission over self. And I
Hmm.
think in many cases, when they had difficulties and each one could tell a story, they had a way of letting that roll off so that they could keep the work of the institution or the needs of students at the forefront of their work.
And just to build on that too, one of the real challenges is how short presidents' tenures are these days. There's a lot of turnover in the space. The great resignation certainly hit this particular role. And now we're in a place where we really do want to have that continuity of care and vision. North Star is something people talk about a lot, where if you have a leader who can stay committed to that, it sort of builds that resilience from the top down within the university.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's true. And it's interesting because several of our presidents have had fairly long tenures. Others had shorter tenures, but were very clear about what they wanted to accomplish and recognized when it was accomplished and were very earnest about asking the question, do I have the energy, the stamina, and the interest to continue in the next iteration of what the institution should be? And some said, no, I think I've done what I'm supposed to do. And others, then, we have had presidents who had a 30-year tenure or a 15-year tenure,
Right.
which is quite unusual now. And I actually think that it's going to be more and more difficult to have presidents with long tenures. And to do that is going to require incredible support from boards of governors or boards of trustees because these jobs in many ways have simply become untenable. One of our colleagues, as reported in the book, said, who would want this job?
Well, let's get into that part then, where, one of the things I really liked about the book is that you do humanize it and get very deeply connected to each of the case studies in there. Maybe starting with you, Terry, and then we'll ping pong back and forth.
These folks stay as long as they should, and very often it's really long. On average, the 7 we interviewed have stayed twice as long as the average president otherwise. That says a lot. Let me mention two of them I particularly came to know, although we conducted most of these interviews together and we, were able to build on one another's insights. One is Jeff Bullock. He's a Midwestern guy. He's an Iowa, Southern Minnesota guy. A lot of people said Jeff was more likely to maybe rise to be foreman at the DeKalb seed plant than he was to be an academic. He and his younger brother were on their own from age 12 or 13 on. They had to make their way in the world without a lot of support in this case. Many of the other ones, actually, the parents made all the difference. But in this case, they had to do it on their own. Through a long and sinuous path, he wound up as president of the University of Dubuque, Presbyterian related institution. It was failing. People were talking about selling off part of the campus so somebody would build a Walmart on it. They didn't know what to do. Well, Jeff came along, and this is a fellow who says, losing is not part of my DNA. So he made some very difficult decisions, no doubt about it. Frankly, he was bannered by people who understandably didn't care for the hard decisions he had to make. He persuaded the board it was a good investment. And so it went from a failing institution to, as I like to say, and anybody who visits the charming river city of Dubuque will see, it's just a shining city on a hill. A wonderful, good looking campus. The enrollment is up from whom, not sure if they can make a payroll. They've got a substantial endowment. But what it took, not only intelligence and in his case, solid academic background, but as Eileen said, a lot of courage and a lot of guts, and a board who stayed with him, which is that may be a topic at some point you want to pursue because boards have a tendency to say one strike and you're out these days, and that's a bad mistake.
Let me talk a little bit about Mary Dana Hinton. Mary Dana is the president of Collins University now. Before that, she was the president of St. Ben's College, which is a sister college to St. John's University. So very unusual co-relationship where some members of the senior leadership team were jointly hired and other members of the leadership team were hired by the individual institution. So a very unusual governance structure with two separate boards of trustees. But let me tell you a little bit about Mary. Mary was born in Eastern North Carolina in a family with a very, very humble background. She would say they were poor. She entered education K-12 at the point where the schools were desegregating in North Carolina by order of the courts. That was not very easy for the students of color in those classes. They were not welcomed by students and they were not welcomed by their teachers. And Mary tells the story of her mother saying to her over and over that she was very talented and she should go to college and she should use her college education to serve others.
Mm,
So she went to her guidance counselor when she was in middle school and she said, "What do I need to do to go to college?" Because no one in her family had gone to college. So she had no one at home and no
mm,
social capital at home to prepare her for college. And she was told by her counselor, who she said looked at her but through her and
mm,
said, "Black girls don't go to college, they go to the military." And in many ways, Mary's story is a story of overcoming all the obstacles that were put in front of her, race-based, gender-based, economically based. She
mm,
ended up at Williams College through the intervention of the family that her mother did housekeeping for, who provided an opportunity for her to leave the public school system and go into private high school to prepare for college and was not interested in higher education. Actually, after completing a doctorate, took a job in higher ed just because she wanted to see what teaching was like. And in many ways, her story is a story of people seeing in her what she didn't yet see in herself and putting her in
mm,
positions where she could learn more about administration and shine when she didn't quite see it in herself. But she eventually got to St. Ben's, and at a time when many women's colleges found their profiles changing and no longer serving upper class women, but serving women who were the first in their families to go to college, many women of color who had not been part of those student populations before. And she really helped that community think through what that required of them. As part of that process, there was a need to do joint strategic planning with St. John's because they were at a point where the two institutions could not survive independently. And that was quite challenging because the president at St. John's wasn't quite sure they needed to work jointly. So Mary actually worked with both boards kind of by herself, but was able to do it in a way that was acceptable to both institutions and laid a pathway. And very interestingly, now the two institutions have come together under one leader. And she saw that early as a necessity and helped the two boards think about that as something they eventually needed to accomplish. By that time, she had moved on to Collins, which in many ways was a very interesting choice. Because if you know the history of Southern women's colleges, they have not had leaders of color. So she is the first African American woman to lead a historically Southern women's college and has
Mm.
done really remarkable things there. Came in the middle of COVID, developed a culture of care that has really become the North Star of the institution.
Yeah, and then, in a lot of ways, these case studies are a testimony to the importance of diversity and the importance of adversity when thinking about who may be the right leader for your institution. I think we wanted to try to dive into a couple more of these.
In a sense, these will become heroes for us because we get to know their story better than almost anybody. And one of those for me is Robert Jones, the current chancellor, same as president of the University of Illinois flagship campus in Urbana-Champaign. Well, let me mention what Robert walked into in 2016 when he was selected as president. He walked into what they call in Illinois a hot mess. His two predecessors had been forced out due to scandals. They weren't guilty, but when this stuff erupts, the public or the politicians at least expect to see a little blood on the floor. And so his two predecessors had walked out. The place was demoralized. There was this scandal of it wasn't the varsity blues things from those East and West Coast schools. This was letting politicians, friends, and relatives in when they didn't deserve it. That's what Robert walked into. As we interviewed faculty there and eventually others as well, his boss among them, his board members, what we heard is a frequent quote: "We knew we'd be okay with Robert in charge. We knew we'd be okay." He's that kind of stand-up guy. Well, he's also a brilliant plant scientist. So it's, University of Illinois is one of the top public universities. He's a well-qualified academic. He fits in there easily. But where did that strength come from? In doing the research in Robert Jones's story, we looked into his upbringing and even visited the cotton field where his parents' shack was before they were forced off it, as a matter of fact. Robert tells the story of his grandfather being murdered, shot to death on his front porch in front of the whole family because of a dispute that we don't need to go into right here. Robert tells of going to a Dairy Queen that heretofore had been a white province only, and somebody cocking a shotgun across the hood of a pickup truck. Frankly, the troubles that might come to an academic fade into not indifference, but kind of marginality when you've seen and been involved in tough experiences like that. A key
Mm.
thing that I think Eileen and I both uncovered as we chatted with people is something that David Brooks calls a crucible moment, kind of a moment of truth in their lives, sometimes several moments, frankly. But in Robert's case, he told us it came at the University of Georgia. He'd hurt himself. I believe it was in the winter time. He was feeling pretty low. People were shouting racial baiting terms from cars as they drove by. The school had been integrated for less than 10 years when he was there. And he said he thought for a moment about maybe he should quit. And then he thought about all the people that had mentored and supported him, not just his family, but academics at the HBCU he attended and down the line. And he said, I'm not going to quit. And he didn't. And he rose to be, as I say, a prominent academic in his own right, a friend of Desmond Tutu, kind of globally recognized. And he's going on 8+ years at the University of Illinois. He's one of those fellows that illustrates so well the strength of character that can be born in adversity. You find a lot of it if you look at diverse candidates more seriously.
Yeah, and the profiles in courage was the thing that really struck me, where like there's mission, there's purpose, but there's actual moments where it'd be easier to just walk away, but instead early in their lives and really throughout that through line for the rest of their lives, they've really demonstrated that ability to stand up. Can you bring it home perhaps, Eileen, with one more case study for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm thinking of Terry's story, and I think about Mary Marcy. Mary Marcy was born and raised on a cattle ranch in Nebraska. She had a pony that she rode to school by the time she was 6 or 7. But she tells another one of those grounding stories that were critical in her character formation and in her approach to work. And that was a day where she was about 11, and there was a blizzard coming, and she and her father had to get the cattle into the barn. And as they set out, the blizzard got worse and they began to lose their sense of direction. And they had to get the cows back in, and the cows would go in a circle. And so it was taking much longer than it should have. And Mary was getting, as an 11-year-old girl would get, a little whiny and annoyed. And her father looked at her and said, I know you're uncomfortable and unhappy, but these cattle will die. We
Mm,
must get them into the barn. And as she tells the story, you can see how that became her understanding of mission. Mary was a very bright young woman. She said that around their dinner table, her mother engaged them in conversations about current events and opportunities. And she felt like she didn't fit on the farm, but she did not know why. Ended up at the University of Nebraska, where all of her siblings had gone and studied some form of agriculture, but she knew that wasn't for her. But she said she was quite stunned when she got to college with all these groups, the Black student group and the women's student group. And she said, I marched into student affairs and I said, we're all equal. Why do we have to have these
mhm.
groups? And the dean of students said, I'm busy right now, but you read this book and come back and talk to me. And she said that intervention that opened her eyes to the differential experience of so many people, and how, although she'd been born on this tiny little farm, her experience and the support of that small community wasn't what other people got.
Mm,
And she began to realize that the experience she had at the University of Nebraska, where so many people intervened for her, when it was time to go to graduate school and she didn't know what to do, her faculty members intervened. The student life staff played a seminal role in her development. And so she eventually ended up at Oxford as a Rotary Scholar, but still talked about the fact that she didn't fit there because she didn't understand the tutorial system. She didn't understand how Oxford worked. So all of these experiences that she had of being an outsider in so many different ways shaped the way she began to think about higher education. And for her, the driver was, how do we make higher education an equity engine
mm,
for this country? I mean, she really subscribes to the Horace Mann view of education as that which has the capacity to uplift all of us. So when the opportunity for her to lead Dominican University in California came, it was a match in many ways. This was an incredibly diverse institution that was diverse in its diversity. So if you looked at its student body, it had ethnic representation from almost every group present in America. It had economic diversity. And yet, when she looked at the performance of students, there were clearly gaps in attainment. So her goal was to think about how do we craft an education that provides the supports that I got at the University of Nebraska, quite random, and build them in so every student gets them. So there are internship opportunities. There's a very focused counseling, advising program for all students. They trimmed the curriculum significantly, and to get faculty to do that is not an easy thing to do. They did some very innovative entrepreneurial partnerships with private enterprise to expand aspects of the curriculum, for example, computer science. And at the end of this, she actually wrote a book called The Small College Imperative.
Hmm.
How small colleges can really restructure themselves to ensure that they are equity engines because all students are getting the same experience and all students are having the same opportunities. And along the way, she had to deal with senior leadership team dysfunction, board of trustees dysfunction, but always in a way, even when it was very difficult personally, to ground any changes that needed to be made at a systemic level so that
Hmm.
institution was getting better, that the senior leadership team was getting stronger. And one consultant I know said, when I first met that board, it was one of the most dysfunctional boards in the country. And now I use it as an example of one of the most high performing boards, but always situating what could have been defined or responded to in terms of personal hurt and injury, elevating it to improve the institution in some way.
I'm always inspired by what Eileen has to say, but it's not so much that these folks came from a challenging background and got a good job in higher ed in spite of that. It's been the way they led, how they changed their institutions, how they inspired other people around them was kind of nurtured and baked in from those early years. So it's not just Horatio Alger, although it's got that element to it. It's more profound than that. Wadede Cruzado, president of Montana State, born in Puerto Rico, Spanish her first language. She went to the land grant Moralac University in Puerto Rico in Mayaguez, a very well known institution. But when she wound up in Montana, she was almost the sole Hispanic. At that time, that was about 16 years ago, about 2% of the population was Hispanic. Reporter said, "Do you have a green card?" Well, you're from Puerto Rico. You don't need a green card. You're a U.S. citizen. But Waded wasn't going to let that set her back. And she has taken the place by storm. Enrollment growth, buildings on campus, philanthropic support from the governor, among others. We're just emphasizing what's important to her is that as a land grant, to quote the Morrill Act, as institutions were supported to educate the sons and daughters of the working class. And that's where Waded came from. That was her passion. And so it's not just good for you, you beat all the odds. The way they lead and the way they inspire was germinated in those early years.
Yeah, and then it sounds like there's even that forensic approach can identify when you're looking for candidates, there are actual attributes that are demonstrated by all of these case studies. If you like what you're hearing, the name of the book is The New College President: How a Generation of Diverse Leaders is Changing Higher Education. As we're getting closer to wrapping up here, what does this mean looking forward? You did really extensive research, you've highlighted these case studies. Higher ed is still in a real challenging spot in a lot of ways. The demographic cliff, the polarization, what do we do with artificial intelligence? There's a lot going on. What are some takeaways? What are some ideas that maybe are worth chewing on as we think about the future?
Well, Terry, why don't you start and then I'll chime in and kind of go through what do you think the most important pieces of the forensic approach are?
Thank you. And I should say to anybody who's thinking about writing a book on any topic going forward, get a good partner like Eileen Wilson-Oyelaran. You'll learn a lot and you'll be glad you did, as certainly true in my case. On the forensic search thing, I would say the lessons I would offer to boards and have, as a matter of fact, is first of all, look beyond the usual suspects. There's a story in the book about a candidate who was an African American woman who was told by a member of the search committee, you're only here for show. Your candidacy is not going to be taken seriously. You're disserving the institution if you have those kind of blinders on when it comes to candidates. Get beyond the usual suspects. Second lesson would be recognize that broader array of talent, strengths of character. You mentioned, Mike, how difficult the job is these days, how challenged higher education is. Well, you need somebody who's going to have the grit to match that. So that's the second thing. I would say that courage, resilience, empathy trump academic pedigree any day of the week. But in most cases, you also need to have a substantial academic background. And then thirdly, and this is something that Eileen underscored a little bit earlier, provide support for that president, not only in the first year, but on the inevitable crises that pop up as we go along. Nation recently witnessed 2 out of 3 women presidents resigning under some sort of pressure in a crisis in front of a congressional committee. Well, I think the question is, where was the board? Where was the board in helping them prepare? Where was the board in standing with them?
And Terry, if I could interrupt,
Yeah,
all within the first year of their presidency.
bingo. Bingo. New, talented, smart, capable women. But the board kind of said, well, go talk to these attorneys and they'll tell you how to do it. Well, they didn't. They told them how not to do it. So it's those kind of fundamental, mature insights into candidates that's often overlooked and need actually to be penetrated in a forensic depth, as we like to say.
Mm.
Yeah, and I would add to that real work with the board prior to initiating a search. A very dear colleague of mine told me the story once of being on a search committee at his alma mater, and they had interviewed candidates, and it was very clear that the most compelling candidate at the end of the interviews was an African American woman. And yet, when the straw poll was done for the search, the woman was ranked third. And he said he went home and he thought about it. And the next day, he raised it with the committee. And everyone had ranked her third because they worried that she might be more likely to fail because the community might not be ready for her.
Mm.
And so, really having a committee think deeply about what its unconscious biases would be. The experiment with children when you ask them to draw a doctor and they draw a man in a hat. And what does a college president look like? What's
Mm.
in their minds to uncover some of those biases that come because we want someone who came from the Ivy League, as opposed to someone who might not have come from one of the most highest regarded institutions, but has the academic credentials. So, really beginning to pull apart some of that so that search committees are much more conscious about their own biases and their own limitations, making sure they understand the performative nature of interviews and the real important need to go beyond the usual suspects in terms of referencing, to really know who the individual is.
Amazing stuff here with Terry MacTaggert and Eileen Wilson-Oyelaran. It's been wonderful having this conversation with both of you. If folks stuck around this far, we should give them some takeaways, some closing remarks.
I'll be happy to start. We've talked about how hard the presidency is, how difficult the job is. And yet, I'd like to say to anybody aspiring, it is also incredibly rewarding. It's important work. And if people have an interest, and the interest is really rooted in a mission, a calling, a desire to make change, don't run away from it. Do everything that you can to prepare yourself to be an effective leader because we need them very desperately.
My closer would complement what Eileen says. And actually, this is a quote from Robert Jones, president of the university or chancellor of the University of Illinois, when he talked about mentors, that when times got tough, people, if he didn't meet them again, he thought about them and remembered their contribution. And he said, they saw in me things that I did not see in myself. They
Mm.
saw in me things I did not see in myself. And because they did, we now have an extraordinary university president looking after one of the nation's great research institutions.
Mm. Yeah, it's important to be on the lookout for stranded brilliance, for hidden potential that needs to be unlocked. It's out there. And to Eileen's point, if you're thinking about putting your hat in the ring, please do so. The name of the book is The New College President: How a Generation of Diverse Leaders is Changing Higher Education. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you.
Terrific. So if you like what you heard, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.